Welcome back to the show, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, heroes and villains. I'm your host, Deshaun Fauntleroy. I know your time is precious, so we're going to get right into today's show. I have a registered dietitian nutritionist on a mission to make sure people feel confident and happy about their food and bodies by providing a science-driven approach to nutrition coaching that will allow people to meet their goals while still enjoying their favorite foods and not feeling overly restricted. Her name is Jackie Slomin. Now, Jackie's approach to nutrition coaching is different from traditional counseling as she helps to solve people's problems and bring them closer to nutrition-related goals by spending time learning about each individual and what their specific needs are. She doesn't believe in any one specific diet or plan being the best, but instead looks at the individual person, their lifestyle, and their medical history to determine what the best and most successful plan of action will be to help people reach their goals and maintain their results long term. Now, in today's episode, we're not just talking about nutrition. We're going to be having a conversation with a woman that has a specific niche, and I would call her a guru in helping wrestlers cut weight by staying healthy, staying mentally composed, and not putting themselves in harm's way. In today's episode, we're going to be discussing how and why Jackie started working with wrestlers, nutrition as it relates to wrestlers. She's going to explain her methods to cutting weight, some of the common fears that wrestlers have with making weight, how a wrestler can make weight without cutting strength, and she also has a weight calculator. Now, this is very important because I know I've worked with wrestlers in the past. I have a whole wrestling community up in the Portland, Oregon metro area that I'm going to share this with, and this is what makes me excited about doing this. So without further ado, I want to welcome Jackie Slomin to the Sports Mastery Podcast. Jackie, tell us some of the things that you're up to today.
Hey, Deshaun. Yeah, first, thanks for having me. Very excited to be here. What I'm up to, just working with a few people today, getting some plans made for my wrestlers as they're going through the off season, getting ready for their certs. It's pretty much it. Just excited to be here.
So for the individual that's listening today, you said getting them ready for their certs. What does that mean?
Yeah, so for anyone that's familiar with wrestling or just weight class sports in general, there's typically a weight certification phase before an athlete is able to begin their season. And that's essentially when they're going to weigh in, they're going to figure out what weight class they're going to be a part of and kind of get ready for that. So in wrestling, you kind of want to be the biggest guy or at the top of your totem pole, so to speak, in your weight class. So I'm helping them get ready, hit their weight goals, their strength, and kind of pursue that. So that way, when they get ready for their certs and they weigh in, they're where they want to be and they can start their season strong.
Yes. Now, I know in all sports, there's always some anomalies or there might be some outliers. I have to ask this due to your specific niche. Did you wrestle growing up?
It's a good question. I actually did not wrestle growing up, but I've always been a big fan of combat sports, and wrestling's definitely one of my passions as far as working with athletes go.
How did you get into your passion of combat sports?
That's a good question. Let me think. I think it's just something I've always been interested in as a kid as far as athletics go, and just kind of that's what I was drawn to. And then from a nutrition perspective, they're just one of the most dedicated, most interesting athletes to work with, and I feel like I can help them the most. So that's really kind of what gravitated me towards the field of, combat sports and wrestling in general.
No, I can appreciate that. I grew up playing the traditional baseball, football, basketball, track, but growing up, we always had the Bruce Lee movies would mimic that in the backyard. I actually had friends that were, they grew up in Taekwondo. Later in life, I got into boxing. I'm a big fan of the UFC and boxing. I've worked with wrestlers. That's one of the things that made it so appealing to have you on the show today, because I do have an appreciation appreciation for the combat sports. And if I have one thing that I regret as a youth coming up, is probably not doing wrestling, boxing, or jujitsu or something like that, because being older and getting into boxing, I realized that there's something there where you can't blame anybody else. It's not like you have 11 other people that you can blame on a particular play or a game. It's just you, and you compete. And I found that it helped me get over some fears, after 30 years old, when you're in that ring by yourself, just sparring with a group of individuals. So I can definitely appreciate you coming on the show today. I wanted to ask you, Jackie, how did you begin working with wrestlers? How does that, because you have a background in nutrition, how did that occur or come about? What was your first opportunity?
Yeah, so I have a background in nutrition and specifically sports nutrition. So I've worked with numerous different types of athletes from different fields, but specifically for wrestling, I was actually introduced to my first wrestling team. I think it was about 2013, local team. I was being their consulting dietitian, Long Island University, if anyone's familiar with it. And this was really their first year getting this team together. And when I work with someone, I always like to get to know them as a person, figure out what motivates them, why they're there, what they're looking to do. I really feel like that's key before you do anything else. You have to just get to know someone on an individual level. And one of the first questions that I do always ask my athletes is, why do you love the sport? What are you looking to improve? And where can we go from there? And, the answers I got were really interesting, actually, not what I was expecting at all. A lot of them couldn't really answer me right away when I asked them why they loved the sport. And, after a little, talking and kind of getting them to ease up and communicate, they all kind of said the same thing, which was interesting, is that they don't really know why they like the sport anymore. And it was one of those situations where most of these athletes, these wrestlers, have been wrestling for, 10 plus years. They started as kids, probably elementary, middle school, and went up from there. And what they were telling me is that they really did enjoy the sport as younger individuals. And then once they got into high school, once it got more competitive, and specifically around this idea of having to cut weight or make weight for their matches and their competitions, and sort of like that whole traditional style of what I would call cutting that comes with it, led most of these athletes that I was talking to start not enjoying their sport anymore. They said they were always tired, fatigued, hungry, not energetic. And that was kind of the gist of what they were telling me that they really hated. So that was my first introduction to working with wrestlers. And then I kind of sat there and I'm like, hey, like this is a population that I can really help, really make an impact in, and I kind of have the personal philosophy of, I want to work with the people that I know I can make the biggest difference for. And it just sounded like there were so many things that I could do to help these guys not only perform better, but also just feel better, be healthier, and enjoy their sport again. So that was really my first introduction.
Nice. I wanted to ask you, we have student athletes listening. We definitely have parents listening that maybe they're just getting into wrestling. Could you explain what cutting weight means, for maybe our novice audience who's not familiar with everything wrestling?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it's interesting because I don't know if it has a very specific definition. I feel like the term cutting means different things to different people, but in a general sense, it's essentially just manipulating your weight so that way you can hit the very specific number that you're looking for. So as an example, if you're trying to wrestle at 145 pounds and you're 150, let's just say, throwing numbers out there, the process of cutting weight would be cutting down to get to that number so you can compete. And I think where the confusion comes in, and at least in my appropriate definition, cutting weight does not mean cutting body weight. It means cutting water weight. And I think that's where a lot of confusion comes in with appropriately preparing these wrestlers for weigh-ins, for performance nutrition, and everything else that comes with that.
The Sports Mastery Workbook was created for the student athlete and the parent to work through together. The Sports Mastery Workbook was created for the student athlete and the coach to work through together. It was created in a sense and in a way to bridge the gap in communication between these parties and build a successful relationship dynamic. To learn more, visit sportsmastery.com/workbook or check out the show notes page and click on the link. And now back to the show. Yes, I was fortunate enough about 7 years ago to work with Knott Street Boxing in the Portland metro area as their strength and conditioning coach. And later I got certified by USA Boxing, actually have been sat in the ring as a cornerman with the head coach. And so I've been to a few tournaments, and to see how they cut weight it's basically starvation. You're limiting liquids. I've seen them sit in the sauna, sweat, drink coffee, to keep going to cut weight. And intuitively, I was saying to myself, that can't be the most healthy way to cut weight. And I'm sure you've seen, some drastic ways of cutting weight or seeing some things that weren't right. What could you share some of your experiences with that, or stories that you've heard of athletes cutting weight?
Yeah,
inappropriately.
Absolutely. So, luckily, and I think a big difference and something to point out is in the last few years, we've had different regulations come out for interscholastic or high school wrestling, where there are certain protocols in place to avoid that serious dramatic starvation and the dehydrating. So the things like the sauna suits and the rapid weight loss, it makes it harder for those athletes to do that. But as far as cutting, it still happens. And I think that's something that people need to understand, is they think that we have these protocols in place. Like, there's a certain amount of weight you can't lose now every week once your season starts. But for the most part, these wrestlers are still, on a day-to-day basis, they're going through this cycle where, if you're not familiar with high school wrestling, typically, depends on the state, but typically you have matches Thursdays and Saturdays, right? So we'll say we're going to start the beginning of the week on a Monday. You're maybe 5 pounds overweight over where you need to be to avoid getting scratched. So basically you're 5 pounds over your competing weight. So these wrestlers will either dramatically cut down on their meals by skipping them, dramatically reducing portion sizes. Many of them just stop eating altogether. They'll start restricting fluids for 3 to 4 days before their weigh-in and dramatically dehydrate themselves. And on top of that, they will be doing hours and hours of whatever cardiovascular exercise that they can, just trying to shed those pounds. And essentially it's just this snowball effect of, you're not fueling yourself right, you're dehydrating yourself too drastically, too early, and in an inappropriate manner, and you're just causing such physical and mental fatigue by doing all of this that by the time those wrestlers step into the ring, assuming that they did make their weight and they haven't been scratched, they are just so physically and mentally drained that it's impossible for them to be competing at 100%.
Yeah, that it's funny that you mentioned that, because my next question I was going to ask you, let's say I'm a wrestler and I'm doing all the appropriate things, or I'm trying to cut weight and I don't make weight. How is the wrestler's confidence affected from that point, or where does that play in terms of trying to cut weight? How's the confidence affected, or the psyche?
Yeah. So if you were trying to make weight and you didn't, how would that affect it?
Yes. What have you seen from working with athletes in the past, or past stories of the side effects of that, of not making weight, and how they're affected from a confidence standpoint?
Yeah. So I think it's twofold. So if you have been, so the term would be being scratched. If you don't make your weight and you're scratched, you can't compete in your tournament or your duel, whatever it is that you're going for. And it definitely rocks the confidence, your mental attitude, wrestling. And I'm sure you could say the same as a boxer or in most combat sports. The psychological component, the mental confidence going into your matches has a huge effect on the outcome. So if you've previously been scratched, now you're going to be even more nervous about making sure that you get to your weight the next time. You're going to be stressed out. And unfortunately, you're going to perpetuate the same exact behaviors. You're still going to be doing that starving and that cycling and that cutting, because now there's this fear associated with your weigh-in, with stepping onto that mat. So it's interesting because the weigh-in at that point kind of becomes the entire focus of your wrestler's goal. So not competing well in their match. It's just, I got to get to that starting point, and it's just this snowball of a cycle of, we're going to cut, we're going to starve, we're going to try to make weight, we're going to be stressed out about it, we're going to hopefully do it. And when we do, then we're going to start the cycle all over again the next week.
Yeah, I appreciate what you're delivering here is some incredible information. So it kind of leads us back to the beginning with you being a registered dietitian nutritionist. What are some of the methods or things that you teach in terms of proper nutrition, to the wrestling community?
Yeah. So one of the first things I teach wrestlers is understanding what is the appropriate weight for them to be competing at. Are they really going to be getting a competitive edge with their traditional methods of what they're doing? Because unfortunately, and as I was saying before, if you're trying to be the biggest guy in your weight class, you might think that that's going to give you the biggest edge on that mat. But if you're starving yourself, if you're doing all of these wrong things that we were speaking about, you're most likely going to just end up competing in a worse place. You're not going to have energy, and you're going to be physically and mentally fatigued. So the first thing that we work on is actually figuring out the appropriate weight class for them to be in based on their height, their weight, their body composition, and then going from there. And then I think the next biggest thing that I teach them is that even if you are trying to get that competitive edge by manipulating your weight, because again, let's face it, there just are certain situations where, okay, I'm an athlete, I'm going to do everything in my power to be the best that I can be. And I respect and commend that. And at that point, what we got to do is sit down and say, okay, here's how we can achieve your goal in a realistic manner without hurting your health. So we come up with a gradual plan that can get them to their weight goals, but without any of those negative side effects. So without losing their strength, their muscle mass, their energy, everything that we want to avoid.
So is there literature out there that expresses, like, if whatever your height is, this is what your appropriate weight should be from maybe a youth, high school to collegiate standpoint? Are there like some general guidelines or recommendations? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's unfortunately the standard that most people use, and by most people I mean dietitians. It's not necessarily meant for an athletic population. So there are equations out there that can calculate what would be considered your ideal body weight, so to speak. The difference is, unfortunately, that doesn't take into account athletes where you could be a certain weight, but your body fat is not what's considered the average population. So if you follow those equations, you could be telling a 6'2" athlete that has 10% body fat that they're obese, and they're going to be looking at you like, you're crazy, because it just doesn't accurately reflect that population. So that is one factor, but then you just need to look at them as an individual, looking at their body composition, looking at their activity levels, looking at a whole bunch of things that just define them as an individual.
So there's no metric that's specific to wrestlers, though, in terms of height and weight and where they should be. That's what I was asking.
Got it. Let me think about that. That's a good question. Just because, yeah, it has to be, there's no standard. It has to be based on the individual, unfortunately. So I guess the answer is no, there's not a specific guideline for exactly how much a wrestler should weigh. So it does have to be based on a few different things.
That makes sense. And I'm reflecting more in a sense, of always, or in the past, being in the journals of the National Strength and Conditioning Association. And I know they research different like football populations, volleyball and basketball populations, and seeing if they did anything particular with wrestlers and came up with something. I just find it intriguing, the subject to be intriguing itself, and you being an expert in that area. So that's where the question was coming from.
No, got it. I mean, absolutely, it's a good question. One of the things that I learned about research, because I'm a big person, I love looking at studies and seeing what's coming out there, is you never really know what you think you do because there's hundreds of these studies that get published every day. So you know what?
Right.
It's entirely possible that maybe today, maybe tomorrow, that information's going to come out. So I will always be on the lookout.
Yes, and in 18 months, there's something completely
Yep,
different.
exactly. That's the great and the confusing thing about nutrition is it's always evolving and expanding.
So listening to you so far, when it comes to definitely like youth, high school, collegiate wrestling, and it sounds like, are you still at the college level or are you working with high schools also?
So I do primarily work with high school wrestlers and occasionally collegiate, but my focus right now is really at that high school level when they're just entering, and that way it's really the best time to reach these athletes and get them set up for success. So that way when they do move on to that next level of competition, they're ready to go. They know exactly what they need to do.
Yeah, and I could see that with, you're working with teenagers, you got all these different social dynamics going on, and then looking at cutting weight, I can tell that is a big thing, at the youth and the high school level. If you get scratched, now you're thinking about, it's almost like just the way in becomes the competition or the focus, like you said. What are the common fears for making weight?
Yeah, so essentially it's just it's really, I'm just going to say it's just probably a little different for everyone, but again it just really is, it comes down to being scratched. So no one wants to be spending these hours and hours training, getting ready for their matches, and then like I said, come their way in, they end up stepping on that scale and being over and just not being able to compete. And like you said, it's wrestling is an interesting sport because while you're answering to yourself when you step on that mat, but there is still this disappointment that arises when now you've sort of let your team down. You can't compete. You can't go and do what you came to do. It's game over. It's like not even getting to the starting line of a race that you're trying to run. So that kind of perpetuates that fear. And that's what usually ends up with these traditional cutting cycles is it's that fear of the fear of not being able to make it.
So have you in the past, have you worked with any kids that had struggled making weight, and does depression come with that if that happens on more than one occasion, or how do you get an athlete out of a slump at that point?
Yeah, that's a good question. Depression itself, I mean, I could speculate. I certainly couldn't say for sure if someone could be diagnosed with like depression, but do they get into a depressive state? Absolutely. Do they get into a slump? 100%. And like I said, it really just takes away from their mental confidence. And what you really got to do at that point is show them the right way of approaching these things and really coming up with a plan that they can get on board with, they can feel confident about, and also just something that they can trust. And I can't emphasize the word trust enough because when you're trying to make weight, you need to be able to trust that process. If you don't, that's when that fear kicks in. And that's when, again, that starving, that cutting, that traditional cycling of what we want to avoid kicks in again.
Speaking of doing things the right way, how can a wrestler make weight without cutting strength?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's predominantly when I work with people. So I guess I would say that the answer, and probably what could be said in any area of any sport, is that planning is really going to be key. So like we were talking about before, you're going to need to take that person on an individual basis and figure out if they're going into the right weight class. So if you are competing at the right weight for you, or if sitting closer to what your natural weight is a better formula for success instead of trying to go down sometimes 10 or 20 pounds, which is what some of these wrestlers do. They think that the competition at these earlier stages, at these lighter weights, is going to be easier. But the truth is that an athlete's going to be competitive no matter where they're at. So going down a class, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get that edge. So definitely, like I said, there's a lot of different variables that come into play with that, and talking to your coach, figuring out what the best plan is for you can help provide some insight. And then once you know where you're going to be sitting at, coming up with a plan way in advance of your certs and really the beginning of the season is kind of the key to success for that. So The way that wrestlers can make weight without cutting strength is by having a plan that promotes very gradual weight loss. And a good rule of thumb for that, and what I use personally with my own wrestlers, is trying to follow what's called the 1.5% rule. So what the 1.5% rule is, and it's pretty simple once you break it down, is that wrestlers really can't lose more than 1.5% of their total body weight in any given week. And when you're trying to lose rapid weight, when you're starving and cutting and going down to a number that's much lower than what that percentage is, you are essentially doing the opposite of what you're hoping for. So instead of losing body fat and, being more athletic, more muscular, stronger, if you're rapidly losing weight, you're most likely losing lean muscle tissue. So your strength, your muscles, instead of the body fat that you're hoping for. So by following that 1.5% rule and calculating what that would be for your own individual wrestler, you can sort of set up what that weight descent plan would look like and help them reach that without hurting their performance.
Yes. Speaking of strength and speaking of muscle mass, and when it comes to cutting weight, and we're talking about these things as far as maybe, competing closer to your natural weight, where maybe you only have to lose 3, 5, maybe 7 pounds before a competition. How important is strength and conditioning at that point at the high school level, or when you're working with maybe some of the kids that maybe aspire to wrestle at the next level? Where does strength play in relationship to their weight and nutrition?
I think it has a huge impact because your weight is important. I wouldn't say that it's not. Your weight is important in wrestling, but what's more important, or at least what I would argue, is your body composition and, like we were saying, your strength. So if you have a wrestler that is kind of going into their weight search as an example, and they have been preparing for their entire summer, they're going through their strength and conditioning, they're feeling strong, they're feeling healthy, they're feeling energetic, and then all of a sudden, it kicks in that, 3 to 4 weeks before your weight search happened, you realize you're maybe 10 pounds over where you need to be, and you start rapidly losing that weight. Even if you get there, your performance, your strength, everything that comes onto the mat is going to be so much worse than if you had done it the proper way. So yeah, I guess in a nutshell, I would say I think it's probably one of the most important things.
So essentially, when an athlete resorts to some of those old school cutting methods as far as not eating, limiting themselves severely with liquids, they're going to be weaker on the mat, or there's going to be performance declines in more than one area. It sounds like that's what you're telling me.
Absolutely. And not even just on the mat, during their training, during just even getting regular sleep, their energy throughout the time leading all the way up to their competition is going to be hindered as well. So it's really just a snowball effect. And obviously, of course, when you get on the mat as well, you're not going to react as quickly. You're going to be fatigued. You're not going to be at 100%.
Looking at your website and learning more about you leading up into this conversation, I know you have a weight calculator for wrestlers. Tell us about that.
Yeah. So I sort of made this. It's a tool that I use with my own wrestlers, and kind of what we were talking about with creating a weight descent plan that's not going to sacrifice strength. What this calculator does is it's very simple. You plug in what your wrestler's weight is, what their goal weight is, and then it automatically calculates how much weight they can lose as a max per week using that 1.5% rule. So it's essentially a tool that could help kind of get you started on a descent plan by mapping out, again, how much weight you could lose in any given week, but then also showing you what that would look like over several weeks. So you can plug that in and then take a look at that and say, okay, hey, if I need to drop 7 pounds, this is telling me that it's going to take a minimum of, we'll just throw a number out there, 5, 6 weeks, whatever it's calculated based off that 1.5% rule. And you can use that as the beginning of a plan to get where you need to be before your search. So that way you realize, okay, I need to start at least this soon and kind of go in from there. That way, when you are going for that alpha weigh-in, you can get strong, you can go in strong, and you're not panicking and kind of falling prey to that traditional cutting and that starving that we were talking about.
So if I'm a sports parent or a student athlete listening to this, Jackie, is your weight calculator, is that an app, or is it something on your website, or how would people learn more about your calculator?
It's a free download on my website, and really simple is the file. It's just an Excel file, and it's all pre-programmed for you. So once you open it, you literally just have to put in your wrestler's weight and their goal weight, and it's already set up to do all of the calculations for you.
Why don't you tell my audience where they can find your website at, Jackie?
So my website, really simply, it's just www.jackieslomin.com. And you can go on there, find more information, download the calculator, and just get more resources for nutrition for your wrestlers.
And where were they? Are you on any of the other socials that, my audience can find you at?
Predominantly, I guess I'm a little old school. I'm just predominantly on Facebook. So you can search my name, Jackie Slomin. It'll come up as a sports dietitian for wrestlers. So I have a page there. I do also have a free nutrition support group for wrestlers. So if you ever have any questions you're looking to get answered, or just getting feedback either from me or from other parents in the wrestling community, that's available as well.
That's incredible. I can really appreciate that. Ladies and gentlemen, if you're listening to today's show, head over to iTunes, go to Sports Mastery, give us a rating and review. Jackie, I really appreciate your time. If you're in the audience, rate this a 5-star show. Jackie is delivering some incredible information to not only wrestlers, but talking about nutrition in general for the student athlete. There's a lot that we can take to this. I would suggest that if you're listening to this, listen to this over again, because she's delivering some high-powered information for the student athlete, the sports parent, and the coach. She's already listed where you can find her at. Before we close out, Jackie, I have one more question. What is the one thing that you would want to leave my audience with that you may have forgot to discuss earlier, or that you would want to discuss before we close
that's a good question. So I think the one thing that I think every athlete and parents and coach can benefit from hearing, and it's something that everyone's heard beforehand, but just having a plan is planning for success. So taking some of these things that we've spoken about, coming up with a plan for your wrestler, or reaching out and getting help from someone that can make that for you, is really how you're going to set them up for success. So don't wait until the beginning of the season. Don't wait until the first day where you're going to start panicking. Just really having those plans in place, getting that set up and kind of going, is the best thing that you could do in season, in life, in any area, really.